friends, it's Caitlin. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about my top 7 tropes in young adult literature. There are many tropes that I've seen in reading young adult books and ones that are on my bookshelf, but I'm picking the top 7 that I think are the most common that I have found, and I'm going to be talking about each of them, whether or not I like that particular trope, and then giving you 1 or 2 examples of books that utilize that trope and whether or not I think it's done well, to kind of give you guys some examples. So let's go ahead and jump in and get started. Number 1 is the enemies to lovers trope. This is where someone who is typically seen as an enemy or two people who really despise or dislike each other in the beginning grow over the course of the novel and eventually end up falling in love. And this is often a very common young adult trope because I know that a lot of readers really love seeing people kind of argue and be at odds but then end up falling in love. And a really good example of a series that includes this trope is the Kiss of Deception series by Mary E. Pearson. And I'm including both of the books. I have not read The Beauty of Darkness, which is the 3rd book, but that is on my TBR, so hopefully I'll be able to finish out these series. But I have read The Kiss of Deception, which is the 1st book, and The Heart of Betrayal, which is the 2nd book. There is a love triangle in here, which is one trope that I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the video, but that triangle consists of 2 enemies towards the main character, Leah, who eventually become involved in that love triangle with her. One is the prince that she runs away from on her wedding day, and then the other is an assassin which another kingdom sends to kill her. So as you can see, these are 2 people that she does not really want to end up falling in love with. However, I feel like the way that Mary E. Pearson writes it, Leah does not know their true identities, and so this really can't be seen as the typical trope of enemies to lovers because Leah doesn't really know that they are in fact her enemies. But over the course of the novel, the relationships grow outside of that fact, and I really enjoyed it. I think that it's done really well. I really want the love triangle to just end. Well, I'll talk about love triangles a little bit later. This series was really good, and I feel like the trope of enemies to lovers was done really well. So kudos to Mary E. Pearson, because it's sometimes a hard thing to do enemies to lovers right, because of course there's that tension and you want it to be really balanced. You don't want the relationship to be so negative that there's no way to overcome that. So it's a precarious balance, but I think that in The Kiss of Deception it is done really well. Another really good book that utilizes this enemies to lovers trope, and it's probably one of the best books on my bookshelf that I can think of for this trope, is Legend by Marie Lu. 2 characters in this book, and I don't want to give you guys spoilers, but you can probably guess who they are, end up falling in love whenever in fact they are very bitter enemies in the beginning. They pretty much want to kill each other. One of the characters makes it her mission to kill the other one. And so there's a lot of tension in the beginning, and they're definitely enemies. There's a lot of just hatred. One despises the other, and they just live on very different sides of the world pretty much, not physically, but in terms of their social status and their motivations and their past. And so there is a lot of discord between them, but then over the course of the novel they end up growing close, and once they realize the truth behind their past and some things that they had believed in previously, they end up falling in love. And I loved it in this book. I thought that the enemies to lovers was done so well, and it just made sense for these 2 characters, and it was so natural how they ended up falling together, and so I really loved it. This is another great example of where the trope was done really well. Alright, number 2 on my 7 YA tropes is the misunderstood love interest. This is a very common YA trope. It's often used kind of as a parody because of how common it is, where like the bad boy type becomes the lover, or what's typically known as like the jerk type becomes the lover or becomes a best friend, or eventually the relationship becomes one of a positive nature instead of a super negative nature. So this is a really common trope, and I could probably name a bunch of books that utilize it. Basically, as you guys can probably guess, the general idea behind this is that there is a character who is typically male that is misunderstood and perceived as being an antagonist and being against the main character, but over the course of whatever book it is included in, they eventually, their true intentions are revealed and they become a protagonist or a supporting character, or a lot of times the main character ends up falling in love with them. The number 1 book that I can think of for this trope that is a super popular book, and you guys will probably all know and understand why I chose this, is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, because Mr. Darcy is probably the number 1 most misunderstood character in literature ever. And this isn't a young adult book, so technically it probably doesn't count, but a lot of young adult readers and booktubers have read it. It is a classic. It is one of my favorite books, if y'all don't know. So obviously I think that the trope is done well in this book. I think it is just a classic example of a misunderstood character. Mr. Darcy is somebody who in the beginning, whenever I first started reading this book, I did not like at all. As I think many readers don't as well whenever they start reading this. And I was so confused because I knew that Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy ended up together, and I just did not understand how she could possibly ever fall in love with somebody so arrogant and just small, narrow-minded. But then over the course of the novel, you know, obviously his true colors are revealed and they grow together, and I'm sure that y'all know this probably isn't a spoiler, they fall in love. So that is just, I love this trope so much, and it was just so well done, and it's probably my #1 case of misunderstood love interest in all of literature, and I'm sure that y'all will probably agree Mr. Darcy is definitely one of the biggest misunderstood love interests that there is, and in this case I think that it was done super well. For a more modern take on this trope, I chose The Evaporation of Sophie Snow by Mary Weber. This also has a misunderstood character in it and is actually one of the point of view characters, Miguel, and without giving too many spoilers, there are some things that Mary Weber holds back from the reader that you start to really question whether he is in fact involved in some kind of under the table, like negative actions or interactions, and you start to really guess and wonder what he is really up to, and I started to wonder if perhaps he was doing something that I would end up not liking. But as you continue reading and you get further and further into the book, especially towards the end, whenever everything is really revealed about him, you start to find out more and more, and eventually, you know, you find out what he was really up to and what all of those secretive things were, and he turns out to be one of those misunderstood characters. So I'm not going to give too many spoilers, but I did like it in this book. It was kind of predictable, and so unlike Pride and Prejudice, it wasn't like a huge whoa moment where I was just totally shocked with the revelation of what the character was really up to, but I think that it was done well. It wasn't something that I disliked, it wasn't something that I loved either. It was kind of just mediocre, but it was a good example of a misunderstood character. Alrighty, #3 is a trope that is so huge in young adult literature, and this is going to be one of the controversial ones because the first two that I have mentioned have both been relatively positive things. If they're done well, I do enjoy them, but this third one is kind of iffy, and it depends on how it is done, and that is the love triangle. This is so prevalent in young adult literature, and I talk about it a lot because whenever people ask me what's my least liked YA trope, in the past this has been my choice, but now I have a different least liked YA trope, which I'll talk about. It'll be my #7 one that I discussed, so it'll be the last one I talk about. But this is probably a runner-up because I feel like the characters in love triangles are just so indecisive and childish and just immature about it. It's almost like they just can't choose, oh but I love them, no but I love them, and I'm just like, just choose somebody, because for me it's really difficult to really get into that character's head of their real true feelings whenever they're constantly going back and forth between two people. And in my personal opinion, again, this is controversial, so you guys might disagree and a lot of people might disagree, but I feel like there's no way for a character or a person to love two people exactly equally in terms of romantic relationship, which is why in the end they end up choosing somebody eventually at the end of the novel, or they choose nobody and they continue on with their life. But I just feel like when writing, you're going to have one person who, you know, ends up pulling ahead and winning in the end. And so it's kind of just like, sometimes the characters string each other along in not deciding, and I feel really bad for the other two arms of the love triangle who are waiting on that character to decide. So it oftentimes is not done really well, and so that's why love triangles for me are just one thing that I usually don't like. But there is one great example of a love triangle that I absolutely adore, and you guys probably will not be surprised, because it is The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, which is my favorite series of all time. Oh, this love triangle, guys. As y'all know, Katniss, Gale, and Peeta are in a love triangle, and just for the record, I was Team Peeta from the moment that Katniss and Peeta met. I was never on Team Gale, and I'm sorry if you guys were, but that's just my opinion. I loved Peeta, and this may be a spoiler. If you guys know absolutely nothing about The Hunger Games, you can mute it and then I'll give you a thumbs up whenever I'm done with the spoiler. But she does end up with Peeta, so I absolutely was so happy about that because, again, I was rooting for him the whole time. And for those of you with spoilers, you can listen back now. But I was so happy with how it ended up, and with this love triangle, the reason that I loved it so much is because it makes sense why Katniss has feelings for both of them, for both Gale and Peeta. because Gale is that best friend who she needs to be there to help support her family while she is in the games and going on the tour and leading a rebellion and doing all kinds of awesome things. Gale is that rock who's there for her and her family and who has protected her and been her best friend her whole life. But then Peeta is this person that she has true, genuine feelings for, but then it's also conflicted because she's asking herself, does she really have feelings for him, or is it all just an act? And so I love the conflict in the love triangle, but I also feel like it's so genuine, and I understand why Katniss is so conflicted, unlike a lot of main characters who just are in it because they feel like they love both of the characters. Katniss has really good motivations, and she really is trying to decide who it is that she really loves. Throughout the book, she wants to choose somebody, but it's so difficult for her to turn her back on either one of them. And I really loved that, and so that's the reason why I feel like it was done so well in the Hunger Games. And as I mentioned before, there are so many young adult books that have love triangles in them. We have the Red Queen series, which there is a very confusing and strange love triangle in here because I don't understand why one of the arms of the love triangle is even in the running. It makes me, I don't know, there's some people who are on that team, and I won't say which team it is, but I think that most people know who is involved in this love triangle. There's Mayor, and then there's two other people in it, two guys, and one of them should not even be in the love triangle. I just don't understand. But in the first book, Red Queen, there is a love triangle that does make a lot of sense, but then as the series progresses, I feel like it should have just broken apart, but it kind of hasn't. But that's a whole nother thing. But in Red Queen, it was done well, and their personalities of the two guys that she is interested in are very different, and it's done well in here as well. But as I said, as it continues, then I felt like it should have just ended. But it kind of, there's threads of it that continue throughout the second and parts of the third book. I didn't finish the third book, but from what I read, that it continued through the second and third whenever I felt like it should have ended. So that could be a difficult thing with love triangles, is knowing when the main character needs to just decide who they want to be with and end the love triangle. As I mentioned before, The Kiss of Deception has a love triangle. We also have An Ember in the Ashes, which has a sort of kind of love triangle in it as well. So yeah, there are a lot of books that have love triangles, and in looking at my bookshelf, there are a ton more that I could have mentioned. And in fact, if y'all would be interested in me doing a love triangle video where I just discuss books that have love triangles, how I feel about them, spoiler free of course, and just to give you guys some examples, I can definitely do that. Leave me a comment below if you would like to see that video. But for now, I'll just say that those are some examples of the love triangle trope, and again, it's one that I often don't really like, but if it's done well like it was in the Hunger Games, then it's something that I enjoy. A lot of times I am rooting for one person in that love triangle, so of course it is good tension and it helps move the story forward, but again, it can get kind of weighted down in the book if the main character continues to just choose nobody and kind of string the two characters along. It has to be a good balance of really genuine motivations for why they still haven't chosen, and conflict in loving both of them and trying to decide who it is that they care about the most. So that's a really important key to love triangles, and sometimes it's included and it works, and sometimes it's not and it doesn't work so much. But The Hunger Games is a great example of a love triangle that I absolutely loved. Alright, and please ignore my dogs barking in the background, guys. I'm so sorry if y'all can hear that, but try to just ignore that because they are going crazy upstairs. Alright, and then love triangle kind of bleeds into this next one, which is the new boy versus the best friend trope. And there's that intrigue and that new attraction of a new person and new feelings, and then it butts heads with old love versus new love. And this is very common with love triangles and with YA books in general. And The Hunger Games is an example of that because, again, Gale is Katniss's best friend who's been there for her whole life, and then Peeta is this new boy, and she's trying to figure out her feelings between the two of them, between the loyalty towards Gale and these new feelings towards Peeta. Another one that I know of that has this kind of trope in it is The Selection, and I do not own this book, so I'm going to just pop up a cover right here. I have not yet read this series, but I plan to sometime in the future, and I do know from hearing the reviews and from reading a little bit of the first few chapters that America, the main character, is in a love triangle, and one of the guys is her best friend who she's been in love with for a while, and then there is this other arm of the love triangle, which is the prince, as she's involved in the selection and she's trying to figure out those feelings. And again, I don't know how I feel about that one because I have not read the series yet, but I do know that's one that includes that trope as well. So again, it is very common in YA. The only downside to this trope is that oftentimes the new boy ends up winning out over the best friend, and the reason for that is because, again, there's this, new feelings, and it's a brand new person, and it's often more interesting to the plot if they end up with the person that it wouldn't be typical to end up with. But for me, I often feel like if somebody was your best friend, you may end up with that person. So I'd love to see a love triangle where the main character actually sticks with the person that they've been with their whole life and ends up choosing them over the new boy and keeping that loyalty. I would like to see that, maybe like a new fresh take on that trope. Alrighty, the next two tropes are ones that I'm not going to have examples for because I cannot think off the top of my head of any books that include these, but I know that there are quite a few of them, and they are often listed by literary agents as some really common tropes that you want to look out for in your query letter to make a new spin on or make them fresh and new and intriguing. So I'm going to share the next two ones. Even though I don't have examples, I'm sure that you guys can think of a few off the top of your head that include these tropes. So number 5 is the pauper to princess trope. Basically, this is where typically a girl, I'm going to use a girl in this case, but it could be a guy, but most often it is a female main character, is living in a village or some kind of like slums of the town or city, and they have a really hard life, and then suddenly they find out that they're actually the long lost princess and they're thrown into royalty. This happens a lot, and actually in my very first book, Concealed, this is what happened, so I utilized this trope as well. It is a very common one, especially for YA high fantasy, and a lot of new writers start out using this trope of the pauper to princess or the pauper to prince trope, and so I'm sure y'all can think of a few young adult fantasy books that do utilize this trope, but it is something that is very common, and it's a really interesting concept of seeing how somebody who's lived their life in a really harsh environment can suddenly find out that they're actually royalty, and usually there's some kind of like magical power involved with that of how they figure that out, but it is a very common trope. So that is my number 5. Number 6 on the list is the dead parents or broken family trope. This is where the main character's parents are dead, they died a long time ago, they've been raised by somebody else, or they've been on the streets raising themselves, and they've had a really broken family, or some kind of tragedy has happened to them in the past where their parents didn't love them, or again something tragic happened to them, and or they come from a family that doesn't love them even if they do have parents. And the reason that oftentimes a lot of authors utilize this trope is because it is much easier for a main character to go off and have all these adventures and do all these things that would be crazy if it was in real life when they don't have parents or a family. Because then it's much easier to go on this quest or go looking for this villain and try to save the world or lead a rebellion or whatever it might be. It's much easier to do that if you do not have any family or parents who you are leaving behind. Alrighty, we have finally arrived at number 7 on my list, which is my least favorite trope in literature period, especially young adult literature, and that is insta-love. This happens all the time and I cannot stand it. Typically I can overlook it, but for me it just makes absolutely no sense, and it drives me absolutely crazy that people can fall in love in a matter of days or even sometimes weeks. Because, I mean, maybe this happens in real life, guys, but it takes time to form a relationship and to form a really strong bond between two people and to fall in love. There's no way that if you know somebody for 3 days, you're going to be madly and passionately in love with them. There might be attraction, but it's not love. And so for me, it just drives me crazy whenever characters meet. And especially the reason that I really don't like insta-love is because most of the time it is physical attraction that brings them together into an eventual romance. So for example, when there is an insta-love, the characters, if it's a dual point of view or if it's just a single point of view, they'll often describe the other person as being very beautiful or attractive or handsome or having gorgeous eyes or something about them that is outwardly attractive, and that's what really draws them to that other person. And so there isn't any inward attraction, there isn't any time to build up that inward attraction of loving them for what they are on the inside. There's all of this physical outward attraction, and to me it just drives me crazy because I want characters who truly care about each other for who they are, not just for how they look. And so insta-love often just doesn't handle that very well, and that's why it is my least favorite trope in YA, and I just wish that we would get rid of it and formulate relationships that are true and that are built on really strong foundations. I'm not saying that it has to take years and years and years, but it needs to take some kind of building of a relationship that's more than just she's beautiful, he's handsome, were a couple. I'm not going to go into all of the books that utilize insta-love. I'm sure that I can name at least a dozen books on my bookshelf, and I do not own that many books as of right now. But I know that a few that utilize it are Matched, Caraval, the Sandcastle Empire Origin, Ruby Red has some insta-love in it as well. Guys, even as much as I love this book, Book of a Thousand Days has some insta-love in it. Now, before you click out of this video and get upset, because I know that a lot of you guys probably love insta-love, and in all of these books, I really liked all of the books that I just mentioned. But the thing about it is, again, the foundation on which the relationship is built. Now, I'm not saying that I disliked any of these books. They're wonderful books. I highly recommend them. The thing about it, again, though, is readers want romance in books. So authors give that to them in the form of that shiny new person that they meet and end up falling in love with in the first book. I'll be honest with you guys in saying that in my book, What Lies Above, there is the foundation of some romance, and some of my betas have already started guessing which person they think that my main character is going to end up with. And no, it's not a love triangle. It's just that I do not firmly say that anybody is a love interest. It's just that there are several people that could potentially become love interests, but nobody kisses in the first book because they literally just met, and it's only over the course of like 2 weeks the whole book takes place. So to me, I didn't want my main character Eva to fall in love with anybody in that short amount of time, because it wasn't in her character to fall in love with somebody so quickly. She needs to have that foundation and get to know somebody truly and fully before she falls in love with them, or before she decides if she has feelings for them or not. Now, I'm not trying to bash any authors for putting insta-love in their books. Again, a lot of readers want romance in a book, so they have that love interest that does end up being that romance in the book. However, I just think that oftentimes there's just no foundation to the relationship, and you know, they kiss or they fall in love or whatever, and they have really strong feelings for each other whenever there's no foundation for it. So that is my main reasoning behind why I oftentimes do not like insta-love. For most books, I can overlook it and still enjoy the book, but I just wish that there were more relationships that really had good, strong foundations and were built on more than just physical attraction. Alright guys, that is all for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you thought of any more YA tropes that I did not mention, leave them below in the comments. If you'd like to connect with me, I am on Twitter at Caitlin A. Lambert, on Facebook at author Caitlin Lambert, on my blog Quills and Coffee at CaitlinLambert.com, and I am also on Goodreads, which I included the link down below in the description box, along with all of my other social media links. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will catch y'all next week. Bye!